We've all been there. A conversation seems to be going really well when one comment or question causes everything to shift. You know, there's that question that you want to ask, and you finally build up the courage to ask it, but it just falls flat. The energy changes in the room, walls go up, and what seemed like a productive discussion grinds to a halt. What made things go south? In many cases, it's the lack of empathy in either how you make your observations or how you're asking your questions. In this episode of Breaking Sales, Pam and I dive deep into why empathy is the foundation of meaningful business conversations. We'll explore real examples of empathy in action, how you use empathy to strengthen your question, or how you use a lack of empathy to weaken your question. Get ready to discover why empathy might be the most powerful and most misunderstood tool in your arsenal. We always talk about those 6 attributes of trust. And, you know, it's funny, Pam, I gave that webinar series the past couple weeks, as you know, and people really don't think about trust. It's almost like they know it's important and they know it's invaluable, but they don't really deliberately think about how do you create it? How do you get good at creating it? And what are the attributes of it? And so when we talk about those 6 attributes of like benevolence, number 1, honesty, vulnerability, 2, empathy, 3, objectivity, 4, then competency, then commonality, it's very interesting because everybody, even on the film studies and even on the deal dissections, right? How often do we see people just jump right to competency? I mean, here they are, right? Here they are talking to this prospect, whether it's a cold outreach that you ended up sitting with the prospect or a warm referral that you've ended up sitting with the prospect. I hear it over and over again where all of a sudden the salesperson hears the problem, hears the challenge, they connect the dot that they can solve the problem or the challenge, and they immediately go to solving and sharing competency. And it could be 5 minutes in, it could be 15 minutes in, but where's the trust? Because, right, when we always think about making decisions for change, it's not something we do easily. And a lot of our biases and our attachments and our fears come into play. And so when people lead with competency, I still scratch my head. Like, how do you expect the person sitting across from you to decide on change, which is uncertain, unfamiliar, has some risks, but maybe has some gains, but still it's uncertain? How do you expect them to decide on it? And you're just sharing the competency part. There's a whole part of like the psychology that they got to go through. And so as I was listening to this film study, I did notice that the clients I was working with, their question or their emphasis on questions was improving. How they were asking their questions though was way off.
How so?
As you know, Pam, we always talk about this, right? And for our listeners, if they ever sat down with you and I and they don't know us, and you and I start asking us questions. So like even right now for our listeners, wherever you're listening, whether it's in the car, in your office, backyard, or wherever you are, and you don't know Pam and I, think about sitting down with us for the first time. And we start asking you questions about your performance. We start asking you questions about what you're good at, what your strengths are, what your challenge areas are. Every question we ask, you're more than likely going to start with, why is Dan and Pam asking me that? Where are they trying to take me?
Yeah. Where's this going?
Yeah. Where's this going? If I'm honest with Pam, is she going to judge my answer? What does Dan want, right? And so what became clear is that third attribute of trust is no gimme. It's not a layup. It's that empathy. you really have to work at it. So let me give the listeners an example. So I was talking to this one client. I was listening to their recent prospect conversation. Kudos to them for recording it. Kudos to them for putting themselves in a position where they asked me to listen to it and dissect it and give them feedback, because that takes courage.
Sure does.
So we did it. And I'm listening to my client and the prospect talk, and the prospect says, well, we've had 20 to 25% growth year over year for the past 2-3 years. And we're trying to maintain that growth this next coming year. Our client, Pam, right, catches that moment. Kudos. And they knew that they needed to ask more about the growth, what was contributing to it, right? And how they anticipated continuing the growth. So kudos to the client for capturing that moment. But here's what they did. They turned to the prospect and said, well, how are you going to grow? That was the question. And it came off very challenging. There was no empathy, to the point where the prospect stops and literally for 5 seconds, because I watched it, I timed it. There was dead silence for 5 seconds, and the prospect turns to, our client and goes, hey, we need to slow down here for a second. You're asking these questions, and I'm not sure I understand what they have to do with what we're supposed to talk about today.
Said, oh boy, oh boy.
Yeah. To our client's credit, he did say, well, I'm trying to fully understand your business. And in doing so, it'll help me better align how and where or if we might be able to help you, and what products or services of ours might have merit. And once he said that, it was really cool. The prospect goes, oh, I totally get it. That makes sense. So that was the cool part, right? The hard part was there was no empathy in the question. Well, how are you going to do that? Right? So the empathy part is so important. Our client heard, hey, we're trying to grow and continue our growth at 20 to 25%. He knew to dive into that, ask more, but the challenge was he forgot to use that so important human connection called empathy. And he said, how are you going to grow? He meant well, but it came off very challenging. What he should have done is just slow down and said, hey, that's really interesting. Kudos on the growth, 20, 25% last 2 or 3 years. Wow. What do you think you need to do? What are the things are that you're working on to make sure you maintain that as you guys move forward? Could you share a few of those things? Empathy versus just turning to the prospect and saying, well, how are you going to grow?
To the point. Yeah. Big difference. There's a big difference.
And it was so interesting because you could actually hear the prospect shut down because there was no empathy. And then that's when the prospect jumped in and said, can you tell me why that question's relevant?
So I think too, the other important piece about empathy to remember, and again, it goes to the mindsets we coach around high intent, abundance, and detachment. We had a situation, two very polar opposite situations over the past couple of weeks where a prospect shared, I felt your genuineness all throughout the process. And this client works very hard on his empathy when he's asking tough questions. He's working very hard to position himself as, I am here to help you figure out whether or not we're going to be a good fit. This is not about how we figure out how to win this deal. And the other opposite one, which I found interesting, and I think maybe too why we struggle sometimes with empathy, we had, to her credit, she was very vulnerable and said, I got feedback that it was great up until the point that we came to present to their board. And the feedback from the prospect was, all of a sudden, I felt like you were showing up very differently than you had showed up all the times before. And she said, because when we got on that center stage, everything went away and it was all about, let's get this thing across the finish line. And I thought that was interesting. And, you know, to her point, she said, part of how she thinks about empathy is, am I continuing to remember it's all about them, it's not about me? And this is probably the most critical conversation that they're going to have with us. They're at the end of their decision-making process. And I threw it all away because we got so excited, and here we are on the center stage. We made it this far. And she said it destroyed everything we had done up to that point. I thought that was an interesting way for her to think about that.
That happens a lot. And for our listeners, many of you have been there, where you work really hard to stay objective with your prospect to the point where you've done actually a really good job in those first few conversations. You've maintained your objectivity and you've really focused on that benevolence piece of seeking to understand the prospect's experiences and perspective, which is outstanding. Then all of a sudden you get the go light to present, and everything that you did went out the door.
Everything. And to her credit, Dan, she shared the feedback email from the prospect, and there were 2 key sentences in there. You talked all about yourselves. And number 2, we felt your egos in that discussion. How interesting for a prospect to share it like that. And she says, when the prospect sends the email, she says, I know this is going to be difficult to hear. I hope you won't dismiss it.
Wow.
Yeah. You talked all about yourselves and you led with your egos. We felt your egos in that room.
You need to get her name and contact information. She sounds like she could be an outstanding coach.
Well, and you know what's so funny? Our client said, can you only imagine even how strengthened that was, knowing that all the while up to this, we had treated these interactions very differently. We had made it more about them than us. We used a great deal of empathy in the decision they were looking to make. So to have that experience and then have us all show up and lead with our egos and how great we are and talking all about us, it was a polar opposite experience. Empathetic to not empathetic at all.
My opinion is, and it is only my opinion, it does come from almost 20 years of coaching observations and conversation dissections, but my opinion is that when you jump to competency, it's your hiding spot. It's because you don't have enough courage or confidence to ask questions, and you're doing a poor job of listening, so you don't even know what to ask, and so you panic a little bit, and then you just jump to what you know. Now, I understand some of our listeners, they have a really good natural feel, and so they know when to apply competency and when not, naturally. But honestly, that's probably about 10 or 15, maybe 10% of the people that we've ever coached. But they're out there, you know.
They are.
You know, I think for our listeners, here's a great way. Empathy is not fluff. I can't be more candid.
Or syrupy in your language. I hear that too.
Syrupy, yeah. If I could use an F-bomb right now, I probably would, just to make my point. But syrupy is a good analogy. It's not just this layer of icing or frosting that you put over crap. It's not.
Yep. Ooh, I like that, Dan. I like that.
Well, you got me going with the syrupy. For our listeners, just key in here. You're sitting with me for the first time over that cup of coffee because someone told you to sit with me. I'm a performance coach. You don't know me at all, and you might have taken the meeting with me out of obligation. Now we're sitting over this cup of coffee. We're talking, you're trying to get a feel for me. Absolutely. I'm trying to get a feel for you. Then, with that one moment of honesty that you have, maybe even a slight moment of vulnerability that you have in this conversation with me, you share an area that you actually do know is a vulnerability of yours and you'd like to improve. So you decide in that moment, I'm going to share something with Dan. I really do want to and could get better at X, whatever X is. That is a vulnerable moment for you. That's an honest moment for you. And then I do one of two things. Number one, I turn to you and I start trying to solve X for you. How are you listening to me? I mean, think about it. I immediately try to solve. I am now making it about me. I am now making it about my expertise and solution and how much you need it. That's not going to go over well because you were vulnerable. Or B, I turn to you and go, well, why haven't you solved X? How are you going to feel in that moment? Because you did. You had an honest moment. And then I come in with, well, why haven't you solved it? I'm an asshole at that point. I am. I may not mean to be, but I am. At that moment, I need to seek to understand you with empathy because you were just honest with me. Now, there's degrees of honesty, there's degrees of vulnerability. I get it. But if you're going to share a pain, a problem, a challenge area with me, there is a degree of honesty and maybe a slight bit of vulnerability that you are now experiencing with me. And I come in with, well, why haven't you solved it? Or what are you going to do to solve it? It's going to shut you down.
Absolutely.
I got another story that, this has happened a few times, but this happened about 2 weeks ago. I'm talking to one of our clients. It's a one-on-one. We're doing a dissection of their conversation. And they had a really good conversation. At the end of the conversation, all right, I don't know if it was a COO or a CFO. I can't remember. I'll say it was a CFO. Turns to my client and says, yeah, you know what? It's been pretty good today. I've actually gotten a lot out of it. I'd like to meet again, and I'd like to learn more about this specific area. I got it, right? For any sales professional out there,
That feels good.
that feels good. There's some immediate validation, like, okay, all right.
Here we go.
Here we go, right? Come get you some, right?
Got one on the hook.
Our client knew not to end it there, right? They knew that, hey, don't label that as good. I need to ask a few questions, which is outstanding. The problem was, this is someone who needs to continue to work on their empathy. They turned to the prospect and they said or asked, why do you want to meet again? I mean, the premise of what they were trying to do, which is get clarity on what was on the CFO's mind, 100%. If you're a listener right now, you should do that every time. But you don't want to turn to the person after they just said, hey, I'd like to talk again, and I'd like to talk about X. And you just turn to them and go, why do you want to meet again? What should have happened, right? And it's wording. I get it. These are my words. But
Yeah, it is all about wording.
But you turn to the person and you say, okay, that's great. I feel the same way. I'd enjoy another conversation as well, just so we can better prepare. What specifically is on your mind? Empathy.
Empathy. Well, Dan, it reminds me of something. I don't know if you even remember this, but I do feel like sometimes we convince ourselves we don't need to utilize empathy if we've been referred into somebody and there's some sort of warm connection. I think, and us both being in sales, I think we would both agree that salespeople look at that as a better way to have a meeting. Someone has referred you in. But I don't know if you remember this, but about 5 years ago, I was referred to somebody by one of our clients. And the minute we sat down, he said, I know client ABC knows you and love you. You are a complete stranger to me. And he said, and I need you to remember that. And I was like, okay. And I said, are you okay if you kind of tell me why you were so adamant about that? And he said, that was the end of our conversation. He says, because you can't believe, I feel sometimes when people have been referred in, they think that's more meaningful to the person sitting across the table. He said, you're still brand new to me. I still don't know you. I'm glad my friend knows you and trusts you, but I don't yet. And he said, it just feels like people don't appreciate that. And I'm like, wow, wow. So you can imagine, it sounds like he's had several experiences where he's asked somebody he knows and trusts for a recommendation, and that person sits down and takes a lot for granted because they've been introduced by somebody else. And I hear this all the time from sales professionals, and me included, I felt this way too, that it means it's going to be a better meeting. And I think maybe we don't use as much empathy in those types of situations because we think the trust is already there. And it was a good reminder from this gentleman, no, it's not necessarily. It's not.
Pam, you just said something at the end there that so spot on. I mean, I love the message to begin with about, hey, I need you to treat this, okay, as if we're strangers, because we are. But what I really liked is, and our listeners have heard us say this, but I can't emphasize this enough because I still see it every day and every week. The level of trust or the type of trust, you can call it type, you can call it level, whatever you want to call it, that you need to get an intro meeting is very, very different than the level or type of trust you need for someone to feel safe in giving you honest and vulnerable answers, which is still a different type and level of trust that you need to create with someone before they'll even start thinking about, do I need Pam? Do I want to tease this out with Pam? And then, not to be redundant, but I think everybody gets the next point I'm going to make, which is, and all three of those levels are even different than the level someone needs to go and say, hey, should I invest here time, effort, and money in working with Pam or working with whoever? So I think people just, trust is not, it's not this flat just paradigm or trajectory. You have to keep building different levels, and empathy is important. But I'll ask this, Pam, as we wrap up. What do you think people need to do to try to help themselves and remind themselves about empathy and allow themselves to maybe communicate more with it?
I think everybody has to start being a little bit more cognizant of how their questions are received, to your point with the prospect. Not a lot of people record their calls. And so maybe they don't understand in the moment that I'm not using as much empathy as I've convinced myself I'm using. I think paying attention to the reaction of your prospect, does it allow them to share more? Does it allow them to do that critical thinking that you're hoping that empathy will allow them to do? And you've got to practice. You have to practice how you ask these questions and the words that you use, and, giving the out and letting them know if you're not comfortable answering a question like this because we're not very familiar with each other. I can certainly appreciate that. Like acknowledging some of the realities that exist in the conversation. And that is only going to be accomplished through practice. And Dan, I think a great technique is what you and I did when I first started working with you. I would just sit back and watch and listen. And for those of us that have the opportunity to maybe bring somebody into a prospect meeting with us for the full sake of, can you just listen to my questions? Can you just pay attention to how I'm asking things? Can you pay attention to my body language? And maybe you're able to give me some good feedback. I think that's a really good way. It absolutely shortened my curve on what I needed to do by just watching and listening and learning in an actual prospect meeting.
As you're talking, Pam, like always, you get me thinking. And one of the thoughts I had, you were talking, and you taught me this. What percentage of the population is self-aware?
10 to 15%.
Mm-hmm. And how many of us think we're self-aware?
95% of us think we're self-aware.
So as a listener, there's a strong chance you are not as empathetic as you think. It is something that it's worth working on. It's worth being aware of and working on that awareness. The individuals that I used as an example, they do film study on their own. Nobody makes them. And they record calls periodically on their own. And they do it because they want to get better. And it's not easy for them. And when they both heard in the two separate examples I gave of how they asked that question, you could just see them go, oh.
I'll bet. It's hard.
Yeah. Empathy, all right? Again, it's not the syrup. It's not the icing and the frosting. It's hard work, and it matters because what it is it's human connection. Our superpower as human beings is our social connectability, even if that's a word. That's our superpower. Empathy is a big part of being able to leverage that superpower. So you got to work on it.
And as you know, Dan, I think humility is also a big part of that, our superpower. And I want to do an episode on humility here coming up.
Yeah, we'll tell our audience this. We have some really, really good episodes coming up with some guests as well. But Pam and I have been talking about this concept of humility, and I'm looking forward to that one.
Awesome.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want you to consider something. When was the last time you listened to your own sales conversations? When was the last time you recorded yourself and listened to how you engage your prospects and clients? Not just remembering them, but really listening to how your questions land and how your prospects respond. Having more meaningful conversations isn't about having all the right answers or showing your expertise. It's about making people truly feel heard and understood to the point where they do want to be open, honest, and vulnerable with you. Empathy isn't a layer of polish we add to our conversations. It's a tool and a mechanism for truly building and creating great conversations. Until next time, keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep connecting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can follow us on your preferred streaming platform. And if you choose, leave a review. You have many options to listen to. We appreciate the time that you spend with us, and we would value your feedback on Apple Podcasts.